Good afternoon, everyone. As the late Dexter King, youngest son of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King, and chairman of the board of the King Center, represents a legacy of civil rights. Thank you. I stand before you as a product of a legacy of attorney, activist, and author Derek Bell, who was born November 6, 1930, and transitioned October 5, 2011. He became the first African-American tenured professor at Harvard Law School. Professor Bell was a founder of critical race theory, a pioneer of the use of allegory and history as tools for analyzing the law, and creator of the course on civil rights, for which he would later use his seminal legal text, Race, Racism, and American Law. I was a fortunate benefactor of a similarly named courses at both University of Michigan and University of Michigan Law School. While many scholars are familiar with Saidiya Hartman's work on the silence of the archives, this paper builds on Professor Bell's work, using history, literature, medicine, American and English law, and invention as we rethink our analysis of the sole African figure, Aaron, in William Shakespeare's tragedy, Titus Andronicus. For those familiar with the play, I refer to Aaron's African ancestry and his appellation, borrowing from Farah Karim Cooper's anti-racist dialogue on the play with director Jude Christian and Han Bui at the Globe last year in February. Professor Bell ended his book, New York Times bestseller, Faces at the Bottom of the Well, The Permanence of Racism, with a letter to his fictional invention, Geneva Crenshaw, citing, "We yearn that our civil rights work will be crowned with success, but what we really want even more than success, is meaning. This engagement and commitment is what Black people have had to do since slavery, making something out of nothing. Let's sit with this notion of meaning making and perhaps return to this question after my presentation." Before attending the Renaissance Society of America conference in San Juan, Puerto Rico in March 2023, I contemplated an internal quest of self-discovery. Where could I find my history on this island? How could I connect with a place where I'm visiting? No matter how white spaces, whether professional or personal, present, I continue this introspection. Soon afterwards, I learned about an old sugar plantation called Hacienda La Esperanza in Manatee. As I arrived the early morning at this now inactive plantation, I saw a few workers, but the space was incredibly quiet. I looked down the winding road across the expansive fields that made up over 2,000 acres. After parking, we, three representative generations of my maternal family from a largely African diaspora, while in the increasing heat towards the larger structure, which I would later learn was the big house, where lived the owner of the plantation, Fernando Fernandez, subsequently acquiring the title Marqués de la Esperanza from the Spanish. As I look across the ocean in Puerto Rico, transfixed by the watery horizon and then jarred by the waves crashing around against the rocks, I'm reminded of this transatlantic anguish. My mind returns to the Middle Passage, particularly as I listen to Daniel Black's award-winning novel, The Coming, a traumatic tale of a sojourn across the ocean from Africa to America. I can imagine the sleeplessness, the anxiety about loved ones, and the devastating realization that one might never see the continent again. I can imagine those agonizing cries of Aluale Kosola, also known as Cujo Luce, whose own journey on the ship, the Clotilda, was reported by Zora Neale Hurston in Barracoon, the story of the last cargo. Immediately, I think of the enslaved Aaron the African's arrival in Rome in Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus. I cannot help but wonder if his fate would have been different had, upon his arrival, he had met our ancestor, Harriet Moses Tubman. She led over 19 trips to retrieve almost 400 Africans who had been held in concentration camps across the American South. Her commitment to liberty was unshakable. Liberty was a lifelong sojourn. Tubman led so many to freedom, but she has liberated even more through the retelling of her story in her own words. What would Harriet Tubman say to Aaron about freedom? What would she say to him about obtaining his freedom before he walked shackled onto the stage in Rome? I imagine Tubman's discussion would have changed the journey we see him confront as displayed on the stage. As Aaron the African, for his ancestry, similarly gives him roots to this great continent, reaches the shores of Italy and the Rome's environs, he is perhaps shackled by General Titus's army for his captured and enslaved status. Aaron shows up enslaved, embattled, and unaware of what his new bondage will look like in Rome. What would Harriet say to him about freedom and its possibilities? What could she tell him of her own sojourn to give him a taste of what liberty looks like as a formerly enslaved person, now with autonomy? As I read her narratives, I use her words to share with Aaron the African. I grew up like a neglected weed, ignorant of liberty, having no experience of it. Then I was not happy or contented. Every time I saw a white man, I was afraid of being carried away. I had 2 sisters carried away in a chain gang. One of them left 2 children. We were always uneasy. Now I've been free. I know what a dreadful condition slavery is. I've seen hundreds of escaped slaves, but I've never saw one who was willing to go back and be a slave. I think slavery is the next thing to hell. Here, Harriet described what reads as intergenerational racial trauma that manifests through a fear of whiteness, bodily danger, emotional and mental unease, and other hellish, dreadful conditions of slavery. If she told Aaron once she met him on the shores of Italy, "Arise, flee for your life," like a rising poet laureate Maya Angelou described in Still I Rise, as a black ocean, leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide. Perhaps this declarative statement would have changed his way of being, thinking, and knowing. In the documentary Amen, The Fight for America, actor and producer Yara Shahidi was asked, "What does racism take from us?" It takes the pursuit of happiness, but it cannot take what W.E.B. Du Bois may have called a defiant laughter in the face of absurd notions of supremacy. In some adaptations of Titus Andronicus, such as the 1999 film Titus with the performance of Harry Lennox, we witness Aaron the African's defiant laughter. In this defiance, what if Aaron had run to freedom? I am reminded of the wanted poster that was distributed for the enslaved woman we know as Harriet Tubman. In the face of the genocide and oppression, we see Tubman the embodiment of that defiance. For I had reasoned this out of my mind. There was one of 2 things: I had a right to liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other. For no man could take me alive. I should fight for my liberty as long as my strength lasted, and when the time came for me to go, the Lord would let them take me. As history has revealed, Tubman was never taken. She embraced this liberty or death mantra. She fought daily for her freedom and the freedom of others, under the possible threat of being sold. Tubman dared to make her escape. In her freedom, Tubman would have beckoned Aaron the African toward his own freedom. Yet Aaron's bondage is transferred from the Goths to the Romans. He remains. In spite of his former enslaver Tamara marrying his new enslaver Saturninus, Emperor of Rome, Aaron remains. In 1915, George Washington Carver said, "No individual has a right to come into this world and go out of it without leaving behind him distinct and legitimate reasons for having passed through it." As Aaron remains with his enslaver, we must now discover his distinct and legitimate reasons for staying in the enslaved condition. What fruit does his toil bear? What legacy remains? Perhaps Aaron the African's legacy is one that is not individual, but is communal. In this case, legal. This legal legacy encompasses access to freedom and justice. Specifically, this essay examines the conspicuous role the execution of judgment against Aaron the African and how it serves within an institutional structure. By judgment, I mean the practical application of a final legal determination. Why does jurisprudence look differently for Aaron the African? How does the role of the Black juror in more contemporary moments offer a way to think about this early depiction of the accused in Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus? How does the examination of a narrative reveal problematic notions of whiteness? How might this play help us think about the role of the early modern jurisprudence and its evolution? This paper is a part of a larger project to develop this understanding of the theory of racial trauma, study institutional oppression, and expand global conversations surrounding social justice. In this search for justice, we should define racial trauma, which is a persistent consequence of historical trauma. Its effects emerge as devastating across the African diaspora. In effect, this trauma inflicts real and perceived danger, threats, bystander harm, or events both shameful and humiliating to similar members of the global majority, which circumstances sudden, uncontrollable, and emotionally overwhelming. Racial trauma may be recurring, systemic, and intergenerational. Yet what of the judgment against Aaron the African? What does the play illustrate a distinctive legal process for him? In particular, this study examines the conspicuous role of the execution of judgment against what Shakespeare describes in Act 5 as the misbelieving Moor, to be adjudged some direful slaughtering death as punishment for his most wicked life, at Act 5, Scene 3, line 142. At the foundation of white institutional structure of judgment that condemns Aaron, it is clarifying to consider two famous cases from the 20th century. Ultimately, as in the case of Swain versus Alabama in 1965 and Batson v. Kentucky in 1986, Aaron does not receive judgment by his peers ultimately. For instance, using Swain as example, at the time, Robert Swain, an African-American man, was tried and appealed. Approximately 26% of African-Americans were eligible to serve as jurors, but no African-American had served on the jury from 1950 to 1965, as reported by Judge Constance Baker Motley in her notes in her 1999 autobiography. Later in 1986, Batson versus Kentucky served as a seminal case to establish legal safeguards to protect litigants from discriminatory removal from jurors based on race during jury selection. In this drama, Aaron the African is offered a summary hearing by Titus's son, Luce, perhaps in exchange for the safe protection of his newborn son with Tamara, perhaps the precursor to what emerges later as plea bargaining agreements to settle cases. A summary hearing, or what is called a summary judgment in American jurisprudence, or summary trial in English law, ostensibly means a lawgiver, here Lucius, determines that there are no material factual issues in dispute and makes a final determination without any kind of bench trial. However, within this play, there is no opportunity to question the jurors for misconduct as one would do in an English legal case called a taint prior to 1825. Though at the opening of Act 3, Scene 1, Titus is seeking a hearing from the Roman tribunes. With weapon drawn at Act 3, Scene 1, line 22, Titus's son, Lucius, tells his father, "The tribunes hear you not. No man is by, and you recount your sorrows to stone." How do we assess the nature of this haphazard judgment in Rome, whether under the leadership of Titus, Saturninus, or Lucius? In spite of the presence of people from the African diaspora, the invisibility within the jury box persists. How then must we assess a juridical body that does not reflect its populace? Africans do not begin with self-alienation, as Richard Helgeson suggests, but they were and are alienated. What happens to notions of equality, equity, and justice? Although at Act 1, Scene 1, Titus Andronicus asks, Rome and the righteous heavens be my judge, specifically his love and honor for Saturninus, what commentary does the play make about the role of race, anti-blackness in the legal body, in particular, the nature of judgment? For example, justice appears disparate from one case to the next. This phenomenon reflects a valid early modern perception of justice, which belies jurisdiction. Not only does the legal body vary, but also do not see the presence of the African jury in the play. It is my hope to answer the questions and perhaps raise more as we consider racial trauma and legal judgment in Shakespeare's play, The Judgment of Aaron. My interest in the problem of race and legal judgment arises out of my firsthand experiences. When I served as a judicial law clerk, one of my duties required that I manage jurors for the circuit court judges for whom I worked. Time after time, I recall prosecutors winnowing down the jury veneer or the jury pool to two African-American jurors in the jury box, especially against African-American defendants. Derek Bell referred to this practice as a charade to appease the white conscience, but it cannot alter discriminatory jury decisions. Before Swain in 65 and Batson in 86, we have the case of the Scottsboro Boys in 1932, where 9 teenage African-American boys riding a freight train from Alabama to Mississippi were accused of raping 2 European-American women. Despite the evidence that exonerated them, including a retraction from one of the accusers, the prosecutors charged the teenagers, where an all-European-American jury delivered guilty verdicts against each defendant, and the court sentenced 8 of them to death. On appeal, the U.S. Supreme Court in Powell versus Alabama in 32 found that the defendants were denied adequate assistance of legal counsel. Later, Norris versus Alabama in 1935, the United States Supreme Court overturned their convictions because the state of Alabama systemically excluded African Americans from jury service. History, particularly legal history, shows us that their presence makes a difference in the judicial outcome. Representation matters. As we turn to the case against Aaron the African, we must note the dearth of Africans as part of this legal body. Aaron the African represents the embodiment of racial trauma as he enters the stage, having lost a war to the Romans, taken as a trophy by its general Titus, witnessed the execution of Tamara's son Alarbus, and all these events happen while he exists in an enslaved state. Even further, we discover that Tamara has used him as her sexual object during his enslavement and later bears Aaron's child, whom she asks the nurse to dispose. The child, too, is objectified. Aaron seems adept at playing the part of Shakespeare's European audience, and he is African. He is calculatingly devious. He is sexualized, and he is murderous. Yet he embodies racial trauma, and that is one filter through which we should read his character, his actions, his words. There is never a time in the play where he is not enslaved, where he is not a war survivor, and where he is not the only African on the stage. Like Othello, Aaron experiences what Ian Smith calls the deliberate negation of his ideal partner. What does enslavement for the entire play mean for the depiction of racial trauma across 5 acts? Aaron's judgment stands in the sole remaining depiction of racial trauma. Aaron's judgment stands as the sole remaining sentence at the end of the play. Shakespeare leaves Aaron's judgment as the last one the audience witnesses. I assume the dispatch with this African on the stage offers meaningful resolution of this drama. This dispatch speaks to this early modern moment where the sight of this African body becomes a site for blame, punishment, and violence. Shakespeare crafts a narrative where we can piece together the story of Aaron, the enslaved African, the embodiment of Aaron's trauma on this early modern English stage, echoes slavery in the Americas, King Leopold II's hidden Holocaust in the Congo, and other countries around the world that participated in this diabolical device for capital gains. In the play, while on its face the judgment against Aaron rests in the hands of Lucius, Aaron's fate looms much larger. First, we see Aaron, who escapes with his son to save him from the deadly fate to be found with Tamara and her sons. Having resorted to flight, Aaron the African now joins the narratives of the enslaved fugitives as folk heroes like Harriet Tubman. These narratives of escape and rebellion, writes Jarvis Givens in Fugitive Pedagogy, represented the feat where black flight from the enslavement represented a deed that exceeded ordinary human capacities. At Act 5, Scene 3, now captured by the gods, Aaron stands before Lucius, who says, "Good uncle, take you in this barbarous Moor, this ravenous tiger, this accursed devil. Let him receive no sustenance. Fetter him till he be brought unto the empress's face for testimony of her foul proceedings. And see the ambush of our friends be strong. I fear the emperor means no good to us. Those American civil liberties or English personal liberties which have been excluded to the accused are not provided, which have been extended to the accused are not provided for Aaron before he receives the threats of torture, confinement, and other manners of oppression. For instance, we could contrast this moment with the 1554 trial of Nicholas Throckmorton, who charged with conspiring with the treasonous Wyatt Rebellion against Mary I, was allowed to prepare for trial, testify at his proceedings, and offered the privileges at the Tower, just before the jury found him not guilty. Heretofore, we have taught this Shakespearean tragedy as a cautionary tale of woe, yet it is for Aaron, his story is more complicated. Let us think of the multiple trials and incarcerations of Sir Walter Raleigh. We think not of the allegations brought against him by both Elizabeth I and James I of England. We think of this swashbuckling swain that we watched depicted in 2007 film Elizabeth, the Golden Age. We should teach the story of Aaron the African as a symbolic, political, and cultural archetype, as one would Nat Turner's Rebellion, if we taught narratives of African American rebellion in traditional school books. There exists an imaginary to the character and role of Aaron the African that we have yet to ruminate, reveal, and research. As we find trauma and judgment against Aaron in this Roman vicinity, we also find a type of liberation for this African, a liberation of the mind, to borrow the words of Chancellor Williams' phrase in The Destruction of the Black Civilization. For instance, eventually Lucius seeks to present Aaron before Emperor Saturninus so he might hear the confession of Aaron that he shared earlier at Act 5, Scene 1. Here he intends for Aaron to give testimony not only against his own self-interest, but to indict Tamara for her part. During the interim, Lucius orders Aaron shackled, deprived of food, maneuvered for the downfall of the emperor and the empress, in spite of his doubts that the testimony shall move Saturninus. Then Aaron responds, "Some devil whisper curses in my ear, and prompt me that my tongue may utter forth the venomous malice of my swelling heart." Lucius replies, "Away, inhuman dog, unhallowed slave." What has happened to the enslaved Aaron as we witness his condition in these colonized spaces? Remark his confident composure. Observe his relentless repartee. In particular, the language of Aaron reveals a self-awareness of his identity. Consider the language that Lucius uses with Aaron and Aaron's response. Why should wrath be mute and fury dumb? I am no baby, I, that with base prayers I should repent the evils I have done. 10,000 worse than ever yet I did would I perform, if I might have my will. If one good deed in all my life I did, I do repent it from my very soul. Although Aaron's speech has been read as disturbing in the unflinching way he awaits judgment, Aaron is actually judging Lucius, judging the Romans, judging the Goths. His speech reads as bold, fearless, and unrepentant. What has occurred before he comes to Rome in this enslaved condition that offers us such a depiction of Aaron? With fresh eyes and innovative theories, we have much to learn from this man who hails from the motherland. Christina Sharp asks a powerful question as she considers this moment where Aaron is placed on trial. If justice depends on the point of view from which a thing is viewed and on the time and location we are in, and if justice is being recognized as human in a white gaze or in the gaze of those in power, then injury slips from slavery, colonialism, segregation, lynching, ethnographic display, incarceration, etc., to blackness or being blackened itself. How is such an injury addressed or redressed? As I conclude, I ask, what would a conversation between Derek Bell and Aaron the African have a different result from the one with Harriet Tubman? Recently in a class on racial trauma, I assigned an upper-level undergraduate students to read Derek Bell's And We Are Not Saved, The Elusive Quest for Racial Justice. In the text, Bell explored the imagined experience through dialogue and engagement with our legal history in America using the figure of Geneva Crenshaw. The name harkens me to the co-founder of critical race theory, Kimberly Crenshaw, and African-American linguist Geneva Smitherman. Hence, I imagine this figure embodying the weight of the work that these two figures bring to bear in their fields, law and language. What would Derek Bell, law professor, civil rights advocate, say to Aaron in this imagined setting? While Harriet's conversation and experience may speak to Aaron's need to break physically and mentally free from the colonized mentality and its physical boundaries, I imagine that Derek Bell's dialogue with Aaron would take him to the civil liberties that freedom may offer him. I imagine that Bell would address those trial rights that would have been afforded to Aaron as part of a legal arsenal to defend himself in the final moments of Titus Andronicus. I imagine that Bell would address aspirationally the liberties founded in the United States Constitution through the key amendments that define criminal procedure, the Fourth Amendment against search and seizure, the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination, and the Sixth Amendment, most importantly, that allows us those trial rights. Unfortunately, Aaron's trial may have been speedy, but it was not public, but a private trial in the tradition of the Star Chamber, the Spanish Inquisition, and America's contribution to the terroristic program, lynching. We watch this final scene in Act 5 as a failure of civil liberties. In terms of systemic racism, is impartiality even possible, not only against the African Aaron accused in this wildness of Rome, but also about the African diaspora accused in the wilderness of white supremacy in the 21st century moment? The problem with jury trials and bench trials, for that matter, still make the headlines. Consider the recent resentencing of Lakeith Smith, who spent 8 years in prison after the Alabama police killed his friend during a robbery. Initially, the judge sentenced the 15-year-old teenager to 55 years. After appellate reversals on sentencing, the higher courts overturned the 55-year judgment. The original judge, to whom the case had to return for new sentencing, from the perspective of civil liberties advocates, had an opportunity to consider this matter time served, given the circumstances of the victim's death. In recent resentencing hearing, the judge reduced the 50-year sentence to 30 years. What would Derek Bell say about the result of this law given against the accused from the African diaspora? As I think about this once 15-year-old boy who was accused of capital murder in the state of Alabama with its storied history in terrorism against the descendants of Africa, I think of Aaron the African son. Aaron attempts to afford his youngling the rights that are not extended to him. He seeks to protect him not only in the current moment, but to safeguard a future perhaps better than his own. Those same civil liberties that Derek Bell advanced offers us a lens of critical race theory through which to review its problems and inequitable consequences for its citizens. Aaron the African, like many men from the diaspora, worries more for the future of the community and is willing to sacrifice his life for the legacy. Aaron, within these terms, stands in the place of Malcolm, Metger, and Martin.
Thank you, Lisa, for this talk. First of all, it's totally clear that you are a trial attorney. I feel like we are here trying to free Aaron, which is really wonderful. My question is, well, it's kind of like a half comment, half question. I cannot think of Rome in the same way now after hearing your talk. I think that we are so... I was a classics major too, so I think I always think of Rome as this place that managed to figure out some kind of juridical impartiality, and that is a lie. And I think that having someone with your background kind of come back and say, stop sort of accepting the fictional sort of tale of Rome is really important. So how do you get students to, and readers of this play who have a certain sort of attachment to it, and particularly those who are like classicists or have classical training, to let go of the fiction of Rome?
Wonderful. Thank you for that question. Something I'll say very briefly. I had an opportunity to share my passion for Shakespeare with one of the administrators in our department, and I told her how much I love teaching English 321 Shakespeare to our undergraduates. I love the opportunity to teach it, co-teach it with Miriam Gallerita, who's homesick with a sick baby. I hope they're better. And I want that class to serve as an opportunity to steal them away from other departments. I want them to become English majors. They could become joint majors, but I want them to definitely become English majors. And so as I think about the possibilities aspirationally for those classes, I think of the work that we use, one of the texts that we use, Emma Smith's, This is Shakespeare. And in her introduction, she talks about the excitement in thinking about Shakespeare in the gaps, in the silences, in those spaces where we don't have the answers. And then that kind of can point back to Saidiya Hartman's work as well. And so I love how this law professor allowed me an opportunity to think in my dream life about what it would look like if we could sit down and have a talking to with Aaron. If we could sit down and perhaps if we just get the right person in front of Aaron, we would have a different Aaron on the stage for those 5 acts. And I love the opportunity of thinking about who could that person, what person could make an impact on Aaron. And I thought, of course, of Harriet Tubman and of Derek Bell. And I think the work that we do, we just have to liberate it with our imagination and encourage our students to do the same. And I hope that we can kind of let go of those traditions that we hang on to, like not teaching Nat Turner's Rebellion. I'd love to see more imaginary work in our field. Yes, ma'am.
Lisa, thank you so very much for this really beautiful, poignant talk.
Thank you.
And I would like us, and I think that this does piggyback pretty well with your last remarks, but if you could talk a bit more about the way you approach the archive, the ethics of the archive, especially since I think in light of the definition of racial trauma that you provided us with, I think that you offer a really important model, and I was curious if you could just share with us how you approach these different archives, right, and your ethics toward them.
Oh, thank you. For this particular project, I didn't spend as much time in the archives I have with other projects, but if I would defer to those who are working on them and think about the kinds of things I would want to see. For instance, as I was reading the narratives of Harriet Tubman, I wanted more from these works. I love that we have something, but I wanted to know more about what she would say and what she do. And so when I look at the portraits of her and the statues of her, there's a statue, and I didn't include in my slide, of her holding the hand of a young boy and running in a running posture. I think about the kind of stories that those kind of snapshots could possibly tell in those silences. And so I encourage my students to engage with those silences and create narratives to talk about those images that we see where there's a dearth of information. And I believe it was Toni Morrison, I'm paraphrasing, forgive me, Toni Morrison, we have to write the books that we want to read. And so if I want to see us teach Titus Andronicus, where we're teaching Aaron in a more hopeful way, as a freedom fighter, as a folk hero, then I have to write that work and encourage my students to do the same.
Thank you. Fabulous. One of the things I wanted to know, or I'm interested in, because I love this play, it's like that and the Jew of Malta, my heart. What do you do with that scene when Nurse brings Titus's son to him? And there is this moment where the trauma seems to fall away from Aaron because he understands his purpose. And would that scene make sense of everything that follows in terms of Aaron's speeches, especially those in the fifth act when he's buried, in the ground up to his head, and he said, 10,000 sins I'd commit, even more. When he does that, is there a moment for you to think about the function of trauma with respect to Aaron? I'm sorry, this is long-winded, but my brain works weird. With respect to Aaron's trauma, racialized, masculinized, all right? And then we know nothing about him in the same way we know about Othello, that we get Othello's lineage articulated to us by Othello, and we know who he is in Venice. For Aaron, his relationship to the Gothic court is a little bit more ambiguous. How do we know it's not the same? How do we know he's not treated as a prince consort rather than enslaved? How do we know that it's not Rome that constructed him as a slave? Therefore, his racialized trauma may be different at the beginning of the play, and that the moment of his son's birth brings him back to himself and to his responsibility to a larger community that you're talking about, and where his rebellion would be then encoded. I'm sorry, that was really long.
No, I love that question. I don't know that, I can't promise you I have an answer to it, but I love how different Titus is from Othello. I love that the way he shows up is not, he's not, his existence, his confidence, his assuredness doesn't seem dependent on any particular person on that stage. And I love that when he shows up, when I watch that clip of him talking about all the things that he wished he could have done, I'm seeing the results of the trauma. I'm seeing the results of, there's no person who's in that anger and defiant in that anger, defiant in the fact that he is in this fractured and broken space, but he refused to be, or to demonstrate himself as someone who is broken. It is broken, but he's not broken. He's wounded, but he's not broken. I should say that. That's probably a better way to say that. And so I love that the way he shows up is so fascinatingly layered. And when I'm imagining him coming from some other space other than Rome. But it could have been many places before he ended up with the Goths. But I think of him as having, in my imaginary, having brought all of those qualities with him from the motherland. And that's why he shows up so differently than some of the other figures that we see on the stage from the African diaspora. I don't know if that answers your question. Okay. Yes.
Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Arthur.
Hi. Thank you for that wonderful paper, particularly for for its provocation and for the sense of defiance in the way that you talk about Aaron, and the way that you introduced yourself and talk about yourself as activists. And it is what, of course, makes the best of Race Before Race, is to see those intersections and see all those things come together. And knowing, as you know, that I like to put my fingers in other people's pots, I kind of wanted to, there is a question coming here and I'll get to it, to rename your paper, call it a Rome of one's own.
A Rome of
one's own.
I've got to write that down, sir.
There we go. You can have it.
You don't like my long titles, so I get it.
I love my titles. But part of it, seriously, though, is also because the word that stood out for me in your talk was the word injury. And one of the things I was thinking, particularly in this conversation, or earlier part of this conversation about Rome, that one of that what we are trained to do, let's say we, quote unquote, through sort of humanities, pedagogy, early modern culture, et cetera, is also to sort of create, like you were talking about, sort of create a fiction of Rome that then that is then going to allow a certain body of knowledge to form in and around it. And what strikes me is with the play Titus, the question of injury seems to be, in the way that your paper is going here, is suggesting, is at the core here, because you're talking about Aaron's injury, right? Usually we're focused on Lavinia's injury in our reading of the play, but that move is as much an inculcation of sorts as it is in some kind of visceral response to the play, or to what we think Rome is or how Rome operates, right? And so to shift it onto the terrain of Aaron's injury seems to me is asking us to do a kind of profound reshaping of not just the play, but how we think, how we participate in these constructions as well. Because it seems to me one of the things that such a play teaches us is where to recognize injury, where to see it, and where not to see it. And particularly on that score. So I was just wondering, sorry for my long-windedness here, but okay, Ayana. But I was wondering if you could say a word or two more about your thinking about injury, except for all of that, just for that question. If you could say a word or two more about injury in how you're thinking about the play.
Thank you for that lovely question, Arthur. You always make me do homework when I engage with you. I appreciate you. I had an opportunity to spend time at the Austin Riggs Center as an Erickson scholar at the Erickson Institute for Research and Education, and I decided to use that space at a clinical hospital, very untraditional postdoctoral fellowship, to figure out how I could marry this clinical work with Shakespeare and Marlowe, and how could I investigate injury in these fictional characters in the real kind of processes that psychologists and other medical professionals do. And so thinking about his injuries as real, whether he articulates them or not, we can see how he shows up. There is something injurious that has happened to him beyond what we see on the stage. And so finding a way to think about where to direct resources to discovering the truth of Aaron, much like what Margot was saying, that we don't know a lot about his history. And so trying to rediscover Aaron and find a new way of thinking about how to talk about Aaron, how to teach Aaron, and how to love Aaron. I think that, for me, was part of the journey, finding ways and tools to rethink how I approach this amazing figure.
Is that on? Okay. I'll be fast, not like Arthur. That was great, Lisa. And I feel like maybe this might be an unfair question at the end, and so you can say, I need to think about it. But I wonder if there's a way for you to put performance studies into your analysis. And what happens if Aaron is actually a white actor in blackface? And what happens if Aaron is a black man? And what happens if Aaron is a black teenager? I mean, I think there's different ways of thinking through injury if you have these kind of performance studies aspects, so that it's actually a performance piece as opposed to just a read piece. And and Farah's adding on an addendum. No, okay, that will. That's it.
Okay. Don't forget your addendum. I love this question too. You, Margot, and Arthur, oh my gosh. I love this curveball that you've thrown at me. I don't usually think of him in blackface. Of course, I've seen adaptations of Othello in blackface, but I have not seen those of Titus, so I have not spent a lot of time thinking about it. But I think it really gives another way to read injury, to go back to Arthur's question. And because we all show up wounded in some way, shape, or form, and having that injury communicated through these other vessels, whether you're considering race or you're considering age, I think is a really fascinating way to complicate this reading that I've done. And I would love to investigate that a little more. I was just thinking another way to complicate that with indigenous studies as well. But yes, I love that question. Thank you.
And thanking Lisa.